Oh, thanks very much. I spent 4 years back in 1983 working in the Macedon area after Ash Wednesday as part of a children's hospital team working with families and children. And a couple of, probably 18 months ago, a woman rang me up and said, "I'd really like to come and see you. I went through the Ash Wednesday fires as an 11-year-old and Black Saturday has really traumatised me." And she wasn't in the Macedon area, otherwise I would have fixed her up, wouldn't I? But she lived on a dairy farm in a fairly remote rural area that was badly affected. And just imagine this: her father goes off to fight the fire. She and her two younger sisters and her mum and an elderly neighbour get in the car and start trying to evacuate. The fire comes and is burning all around, and they're trying to drive through the fire, and she can see that her mother is panicking. And she has that moment of realisation that she can't be sure that her mother's got everything under control. You know that, do you remember that moment when you first realised that your parents didn't have it all together? So you imagine that you have that as an 11-year-old when in fact your life is on the line. It's a very profound experience. They managed to get through, and they lost everything except their herd and their milking shed. So of course the parents said the great priority is to keep the business going. So they actually stayed with the parents of one of the grandparents, and the parents were just fully occupied for a long time, milking the herd and rebuilding the house and so on. And I reckon during that time she probably took up the role of taking care of her younger sisters. And this is a problem that is observed often in the difficult time after disasters, that everyone is so flat out trying to cope with too much that it's very hard to keep track of the way things were organised beforehand as to whose role was to do what. And there's a great tendency, particularly for kids, to see that their parents are stressed and unhappy and so on, and they want to help out, so they step up and they take on responsibilities. They put aside all those arguments about the washing up and they bog in and start doing it. And if we're not careful, they take up a lot of responsibility and don't present their own fears and anxieties. This woman said in her family they never ever talked about the fire. So they escaped, went to the grandparents and just went straight on with it. Some families talk a lot about what's going on, some don't. So she says that about 6 months later, and I can remember them, there was a troupe of actors that went around to different communities, and they worked with the community and built a street theatre production of a drama of killing the fire dragon, which was a great celebration for the community to get involved. And she saw an ad for that and she said to her mum, "I want to go to that." And her mum said, "Do you?" And then said nothing more about it. And she thought, "Oh, well, I'm not going to see that." And then a day or so before it was due to happen, the mother said, "Well, Mrs. Bloggs is going to take you to the drama." Mrs. Bloggs was another neighbour. She said, "I wanted you to come." "No, she's taken you." This is the way she describes her mum. And she found that very moving, but there was never any talk about what it meant. And when Black Saturday occurred, now that's a long time later, 1983, 2009, I used to get smacked on the hand when I got my mental arithmetic wrong in grade 2, so I can never do mental arithmetic in public, but work out what that is. You know, she's a mature woman. She sees all the deaths and she realises somehow the penny drops how close to death she came, and she suddenly has all this post-traumatic stress many decades later of these, haunted by not only her own experience but imagining what all the people in Black Saturday went through. And now she's very disturbed. And she says, I think she saw 3 psychologists, and they sort of targeted her symptoms and started giving her, good techniques we know work for eliminating symptoms. But it wasn't helping because she needed to talk. She'd never been able to talk. And so when she comes into my office, she launches and talks for about an hour. She'd talk probably for 2 hours if I had the time, without barely drawing breath. She pours out all this experience. And she's really need to sort of think about the family she grew up in, the personality of her parents and why they didn't talk, and trying to understand that, and, really putting the whole thing together. And I think it's very interesting how these huge experiences that breach, that rupture, that disrupt the whole framework of our understanding about things, they've got to be processed in some way. We've got to make sense of them. And it's something that we revisit for a long time, as adults even. And so when in families, when they're gone through, the risk is that there's so much, particularly if you've lost your house or you've lost fences or just had your whole life disrupted, there's so much to deal with that it's very easy, and everyone's so tired and irritable that it's very hard to keep track of the conversation. I was talking to somebody from another Victorian community this morning, in fact, and I've seen this person a few weeks ago. She lost her house. And, she says she lives in a fairly small community, and she says, people come up to her and say, "Oh, how are you? I'm so sorry," And I can see from your face that you know what that feels like. And she doesn't want them to do that, to stir up all this emotion. And people come up and say, have you started rebuilding? Are you doing this? Are you doing that? And she just feels really upset. Now, I reckon if they walked past just saying hi and didn't make any reference to it, she'd also feel upset. I remember in a community, another community, in 1985 Central Victorian bushfire, a woman told me, I feel so raw and upset. I've lost my house. I go down to the supermarket to just do some ordinary shopping, and when I come to the supermarket, I know this girl that's at the checkout. I've known her since she was in prep, and she looks at me and she says, "Oh, hello, Mrs. Smith. Oh, you poor thing, how are you going?" And I burst into tears. Why can't you just treat me like an ordinary person? Now, sometime later that day, another woman said, I go to the supermarket, I've lost my house, and I do my shopping, and I come down, and this young girl, I don't know if it's the same one, probably not, but I've known her since she was little, and she says, "Hi, Mrs. Jones," and treats me as if nothing's happened at all. Doesn't she realise my whole life's been changed? Now, I think this throws light on some of the complexities. The general feeling is people ought to get it right. I'm not sure they can. Because if you listen to people in all sorts of situations, they describe being hurt by very simple interactions, by what people say about them, by the judgments people make, by God knows what's going on social media. I'm too old to keep up with it. But, that's a place where all this information flows around. It's deeply painful. Now, I think really one way of understanding this is to see that in some way people behave as if they've lost their skin. You know, that if you've got skin, you feel a touch, because the skin has several layers of dead cells, and then behind that there's living cells, and then there's raw flesh. You know, there's 7 layers, isn't it? Seven layers of skin, of cells to make skin. But you've got to have those dead layers on the outside. And if you scrape those off, the slightest touch is extremely painful, isn't it? We all know when we scraped ourselves. Well, that's what it's like. It's a very curious thing. It's as though the skin has been ripped off the community. And people can't just take things. They hurt. The simplest interactions hurt. Interactions by governments and local governments and helping agencies, if they're not exquisitely tactful and absolutely attuned right, they're very hurtful. Just like a nurse who's a bit rough on your wound, you know, terribly painful. Sorry, dear, they say as they wrap you up again. The nurses, I mean. I'm sorry, we might have some nurses here, but they're often very stressed, aren't they? But I've been very interested in this because I think it points to something that we don't normally know about, and that is the social fabric that we're all immersed in. Because it's a social thing, it's not a personal thing, because everybody's involved in it. And, you know, I had a sort of 6 months between disasters a few years ago. There was no disasters going on. So I thought to myself, I should go and read some clever books about what is social fabric. And I read about 20 books, and none of them actually told me anything about what social fabric is. What is the glue that connects us and the medium of the social world that enables us to interact with each other and to talk and think? Because I notice that when the social system's not working right, it's very hard to think clearly, to make decisions and to know whether your reactions are normal or reasonable. Or, in fact, I read an interesting paper the other day about disaster recovery, and it's got a very clever name, which I can't remember at the moment, to describe that feeling when you think, there must be something wrong with me because I'm really feeling distress, but everyone else looks calm and together, right? Do you know that feeling? But if you ask the other people how they're feeling, they're all feeling, there must be something wrong with me because everyone seems to have it together, it's only me, you know? And this is really because people are protective. And one of the dynamics we notice after a disaster is people feel, if I lose it and get distressed, or if I go and get counselling, I'm letting the side down, I'm letting the community down, I'm letting my street down because no one else is going to counselling. Well, not that I know of anyway. So if I go, it shows I'm weak, doesn't it? Not that everyone should go and get counselling, but if I show emotion, I'm weak. That's a very painful process because it's showing that I no longer feel embedded in a community of common understandings and common feelings where, I understand myself and other people understand themselves. And I think these are really important things to understand, but we find it very hard to sort of describe them because we aren't aware of it when it's working well. You know, like your left knee. You know, if your left knee is working, you don't know anything about it, do you? Have you ever had housemaid's knee where you get, swelling behind the kneecap? Probably not many people sort of crawl around on their knees washing the steps nowadays, but, it's excruciatingly painful, and you just think how aware I am of this knee. Every movement is so painful. I had it a few years ago. Not from, hasten to say, scrubbing the steps, but our body is invisible to us as long as it's working. And I think it's exactly the same with our social body, our social connections. And what we see after a disaster is the social system has to be taken care of, and we have to rebuild skin. Now, I want to talk about how we rebuild skin in a minute, but how do we lose it? Well, you know, we're going along in our routines. Everything's clear and comfortable, and suddenly this great threat comes over the hill or over the radio or whatever, and as soon as we feel under threat, we go into this state of arousal. The adrenaline starts pumping. And what adrenaline does is throw us out of the structure we're involved in, narrow and focuses our attention on the problem. And our whole brain and physiology and so on goes into action mode. Me, the problem, do this. Now, it doesn't mean I exclude other people, but if you look at the accounts of people who've been through horrible experiences, what it shows is that actually I will help people because of the physical circumstances, regardless of how well I knew them beforehand. So if, you know, I have this story of a man in a fire in a nightclub, a little rabbit warren full of little wooden, boudoirs or something, and all these people, these couples were all in there having a nice time, and the whole place starts burning down. Lots of people died. 1949 in New York, it was a really big disaster research subject at the time. A lot of important things were learned, but this account of this man who sort of grabbed hold of his wife, and he's sort of staggering around in the smoke, trying to find his way out, shepherding his wife along, and somehow or another he got separated from her. But then he came across another woman, so he grabs her and shepherds her out with just as much care and attention. And it's only when they get to the hospital that he eventually finds his wife has managed to get out too. But it shows that in that moment, the overriding organiser is the physical setup and the physical survival. Now, if we're with our loved ones, we bond to them and work as a unit. But if we're separated from them, well, we're totally focused on what we have to do next. It's after we get out that we want to reunite. And what happens with adrenaline is we actually go into a narrowed focus that makes us totally focused on what the important thing is for me. What do I need to do to get out? Welcome. I've done a lot of training for people, and I remember talking about the adrenaline reaction, and a woman described once she was with her, I think, 10-year-old son. She was quite a small woman, and she's got this great strapping 10-year-old boy, and they're picking mushrooms in a paddock, which has got a hill in it. And all of a sudden, a bull comes roaring up the hill with his head down, going for them. She was told there were no bulls in the paddock. She said, I took one step towards my son and I just threw him over the fence, like that. And then I leapt over myself. Normally, I wouldn't be able to lift him, you know. So this is what adrenaline does. It actually ignites a degree of power and strength that we aren't aware of, because she doesn't say, oh, here comes a bull, it could hurt my son, I wonder what I should do, can I lift him? No, she says he's got to go over the fence, so over he goes. It's not can I do it, it's what needs to be done. And this really means I've got to completely disregard myself and just be focused on the one thing that's important. For her, the risk was not herself but her son, so he had to go over the fence. She probably had a back problem for quite a while afterwards. But, you know, in this moment, you've got a massive change in the whole way a person functions. Now, I'm not saying everyone who goes through a bushfire like this one is going to be in this state. I bet quite a few are in the moment where they're fighting fires and not knowing what's going to happen next. But let's make it a continuum from being in your normal routine, comfortable, you're aware of everything, you're aware of all the relationships, to falling out of all these complex normal social relationships and going into this absolutely simplified physical survival mode. And in that mode, you let go of all the other complex relationships and attachments and connections and social values and everything else, and you go back to the absolute core values. What's important? Now, making these observations, I've had to develop a language to describe this, and I call that debonding. People drop out of the system and become solitary, functioning individuals. This woman throws her son over, but she's like someone completely disconnected from anything except the bull and her son and the fence. It's just this little moment. Later she might say, who's let that bull out in the paddock, etc., and have a lot to say. But in this moment, she's like that. And I think when a fire goes through a community, everyone drops out of their normal routine, whether they evacuate or go into firefighting or whatever. The only people who don't fall out of their normal routine are the people who put on their firefighting uniforms, go down and top on the truck and move into firefighting mode. And they're part of a complex system which is still intact. But there'll be a whole lot of training and procedures required to hold those relationships. And anyone who's done any work like that knows you've got to train and train and train and train and train until all of the processes are automatic. Otherwise, when you go into adrenaline under threat, you'll lose them and the system will fall apart. But for the community as a whole, there is this moment of debonding, which may be for a long time or maybe for a short time. I think when you've got people, I was down at Malakuta a few weeks ago, and I gave a talk like this. And at the end of it, this elderly gentleman who looked like he was in his 80s just suddenly started talking about his evacuation experience. And he started talking, he went on and on and on about how they were told to evacuate and they went to this place and they went to... Anyway, listed all these names and they were moved on. They were told to go from here and they didn't know what to do and they were all buying. Then the golf club guy said, you come and have a meal. And, oh, it's so wonderful, people help. And he's come into a moment where the social system is working, and then he's told that they have to move off from there and they don't know where to go, and eventually the golf club man says, come back and you can have a bed here, etc., and how wonderful that was, and so on. And then, they went on for, people down there in East Gippsland, they were wandering around the place for about 2 or 3 weeks, many of them. And you could just feel how incredibly disorganized. He started to get confused, he mixed things up, his wife was correcting him, he got the names wrong. You could feel that this was a haze of confusion because he was thrown out of his normal routine. And we all know what that's like. So that experience is a complete jumble. Now, I don't think he was under threat because he left early. But if someone goes through an extended period of threat and then the aftermath of it, it's very confused and jumbled. And people often don't know what to feel. And so they often don't have feelings. This person I was talking to that lost her house this morning said, I'm just starting to feel I've been numb, because she's got a lot of stuff to do, doesn't she? And a functional, self-respecting person puts their emotions aside and does what they have to do. They get out of bed, they ring the insurance company, get on with it. And to do that, you've got to put it aside. So what for that fire, now your fire's a slightly different timing, that was New Year's Eve. So when was yours? So a week or so before. It'd be interesting, and maybe the circumstance of the fire determined the timing too. But I think a lot of people in that environment are just starting to come out of that numbness, because you've no longer got armoured cars driving around the place and soldiers everywhere, and things are starting to get back into a normal routine. And now people have the social connectedness to start to feel, but they haven't got the skin. So every encounter is painful, and the whole community's in this raw state. Now, we can't stay in that debonded state. So that's maybe a moment, it's maybe a few days or a few hours or whatever, depending on the circumstances. But at some point, that person's going to go back into their social environment with this huge charge of adrenaline. They're not going to settle back into their normal routine. They're going to come back and they've got all this energy and all this emotion and so on. And so what you tend to get then is that, instead of people going back to their role, the whole system goes into what I call a state of fusion. Everyone's talking to everyone about everything. Well, not about everything, about the most emotional things that are on their mind. So you get this massive flow of information and emotion, emotionally charged information about what's going on, who's doing this, who's doing that. And it's all devoted to activity, not to reflecting, what does this mean, how do I feel about it, but my God, why aren't they doing this? This should be happening, that should be happening. And maybe blaming. How come this person's getting this person's taking a whole 12-pack of undies. They don't need that many undies, this is an actual example. Why are you taking that many undies? Says the woman in the material aid thing, making judgments. And this lady is so humiliated at being challenged in public. Even though she's lost everything she owns, she never asks for anything again because she's got self-respect. Just one person becomes a symbol of the system. And I'm sure the person who was helping was frazzled and worried and, maybe hadn't been properly trained in her task and inadvertently hurt her. I call this the state of fusion, where everything is too closely joined together. And I've come up with a very simple motto. Without privacy, we lose intimacy, don't we? Because intimacy is communication that no one else is privy to, except you and your partner or you and your family. It's those little names that you call each other you wouldn't say in public. It's the way you cuddle your kids and play games with them and have those little anecdotes. That's privacy. But in this fusion state, there's a loss of privacy if we're not careful. There's a loss of privacy in the family because everyone's in this turmoil together. Now, I don't know to what extent this is happening in this community, but these are things that I've observed. There's a little town called Jindavik in the Alps in Victoria, near Mount Borbor. And I went there, half of it was badly burnt, probably a bit like this area where you could see a green zone and a black zone, Black Saturday. And I went there a number of times, and the last time was about the fourth year after the event. I was talking about longer term problems and so on. And afterwards a woman, I was talking about some of these ideas, a woman came up to me and said, that's right, because after the fire we had the Hug Club. The Hug Club consisted of everyone who was there on the day of the fire, because when we discovered each other, we hugged each other. But anyone who'd gone to Malakuta, for example, to have a nice holiday, was not in the Hug Club because they weren't there at the time, were they? So you get this sense of a bonding and she said, it's only just starting to break down now, 4 years later. I said, did you know all these people beforehand? She said, not really. I knew them by sight, but not that well. So, and you see that you've got very intense emotional interactions developing, not because you've chosen to be a friend of this person, but because you happen to be in the same situation. And other people who might have been friends were not in the same situation, so there's a bit of a difference, isn't there? There's a bit of a gap. And in this fusion, there's this binding together of those people. And then she points to her husband who's standing a little bit away. We were drinking a cup of tea after a meeting like this, and he's talking to somebody, and she said, but come to think of it, I don't hug him that much, right? So she's hugging these people that she didn't know very well, with whom she's got the disaster experience in common, but she's not hugging the man that she ought to be hugging. I shouldn't make judgments, should I? But hopefully she ought to be hugging him. But she's not. So I call that homogenising relationships. So you know how in homogenised milk, you do something to it to break up the big molecules so that all the molecules are the same? Have I got that right? When you homogenise relationships, you make more emotional and intimate relationships that are normally more detached and separate, and less emotional, intimate, the closer relationships, because you haven't got time to sit and talk to your husband or wife because you're too busy doing all the stuff, and you're talking about the insurance and arguing about what you should do, and none of you have got any skin, so you're upsetting each other and you're irritable, and I don't want to be too negative, these are the hazards that I think we need to understand, because I think they're driven by a social process that we need to bring out into the foreground and say, this is a really important hazard, that people need to take care of this process. Because actually, when it really comes down to it, there's been a lot of research in this, that what determines the long-term outcome, not next year, but in 10 years, whether you can actually say, I'm living a good life again, is essentially determined by not what happened on the day, but how you do the next 2 years. Because that's the period of time where it will determine whether you rebuild your house at the expense of your relationship, or whether you focus on your relationship and hold that together, and then build your house as you're able to. Because it won't matter if you build your house in 6 months or 3 years in 10 years' time. What will matter is that you've got a house and you've got a marriage and you've got a family, and they're all working well. And I've got these stories. I don't know which one I told last time. Do you remember which one I told last time? No. I'll tell them again. Of the man who lost his house in Ash Wednesday. Nice, he built it himself out of mud bricks and a horse, a few acres, really nice. Living there with his wife and kids. And I remember that as part of the Children's Hospital team, we had a couple of sessions with the parents and the family, because, their kids were struggling a bit, and we had just a couple of sessions to help them work out what was going on, and they were fine. And then I think we might have had a session about 2 years later. 5 years later, this man looks me up. We're no longer going to Mass, and he looks me up in the phone book and rings up and says, can I come and see you? And I thought, I've got to fit this guy in. I'm going to learn something important here. 5 years later, why is he coming? He describes what happened, that next day, he manages to escape the fire. All he managed to do, his wife was out with her friends for dinner Wednesday night. He describes clearly looking out the front door, sees smoke in the distance, checks out the back door, sees the spot fire starting off up there, goes and looks out the front door, and their front fence is already burning. So he's, grabs the kids out of bed, throws them in the car and drives out. That's all he saves. Comes back a couple of days later and he's poking around the debris of his ruined house, and his neighbour, who also lost his house, comes across and said, well, what are you going to do? And he said, well, I'm going to rebuild. What else can I do? So his neighbour says, well, I'll help you. In those days we didn't have Grocon. Some well-meaning local people, on their own initiative, got out front-end loaders and cleared the blocks without asking the people who had lost the houses. So people would come back wanting to sift through and see if they could find something, and it was gone. That was very upsetting. Talk about skinless. It's very different. You probably don't have Grocon here, but anyway, it's a big contractor who allows people to sit there while they clear the block and say, hang on a second, is that something? I know, you can go on. So anyway, he and his mate spend the next 6 months spending every moment they're not at their jobs earning their living on the block building the house. And at 6 months, he said, I got it to lock up. And we moved in. And my neighbour came across and said, it's fantastic to see you're in. I'm so pleased. I'm going to start mine now. So he feels so guilty and obligated. He spends the next 6 months helping his neighbour build his house. 3 years later, they're divorced, they've sold everything. He's living in a flat near the airport and he sees his kids every second weekend. And he comes to me because he says, I don't understand what happened. I thought I had a good marriage. He may have, but if you don't talk to your wife for the most important year of your experience, some of them won't make it through, will they? You know, some of them won't, because they're not processing this huge thing together, because he's not there or he's too exhausted. You know, it's not a criticism, but you have to ask the question, would they have made it through? And I've had people say to me, you know, we divorced after the whatever fire or flood or whatever it might have been. I don't really know why now, but we just weren't getting on, it just wasn't working. And neither of us has really moved on, but, you know, it's all too late now. Now, these are really, they're just little stories, but I think they alert us to hazards, to threats. And so what I say is that this fusion state where fusion is when he's building and his wife's saying, yeah, how are you going? How much did you get done? Presumably, I have no idea, but I never talked to her. But, you know, this idea that it's all about rebuilding the house now, but at what cost? That's the question. And people can talk about their loss of health, their sense of loss of connection with their children, because actually kids won't hang around. If the parents are not available, they'll say, well, I don't expect anything more from them anymore. I don't talk to my parents because they're too busy. I don't want to hassle them and they yell at me if I'm too demanding, so I just won't talk anymore. Reminds me of the New Zealand farmer. Done quite a lot of work in New Zealand. They have floods and earthquakes. Things can always be worse, you know. You could have a bushfire and an earthquake, couldn't you? But anyway, I won't go down that track. But anyway, this little dairy farming community, I went there a number of times as they went through their recovery. And again, it was a few years later. I was, you know, reflecting with them about how they'd gone through the recovery. And this bloke came and talked to me after. He said, you know, a few months after, now the flood would have been in the middle of winter, so about probably 6 months later, I went there a couple of months after the flood. Towards Christmas, he said, I came staggering in from the farm, exhausted, flopped down, because he's working from dawn till dusk on his tractor, flopped down in the chair, sort of looking at the television, waiting for dinner. And his 5-year-old daughter's playing beside him. And she just says, Daddy, yes dear, how come you don't play with us anymore? Now, he could have said, well, what do you think? We've just had a flood. I'm trying to get the flood going so you'll... Blah, 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 blah. Can you imagine that if he said that, she would never ask him to play again? Because she would think, oh, I'm confused. I thought dads should play with their daughters, but I must have got it wrong. And I've really upset him by asking that, and I don't want to upset him, so I won't expect that anymore. And you just have this moment of shift. Now, I reckon when everyone is stripped back to the bare bones, you can have these moments which no one notices at the time, but shift things. But he heard it. I like to think he heard it because I talked about this sort of stuff. And he realised he's in the process of losing his daughter. So that night he sat down with his wife and they made a plan to go for 2 weeks to the beach as soon as they could organise it. You know, and he's made a decision not to spend those 2 weeks rebuilding fences. By the way, he said, I think it was the same farmer who said, when I look back now at all the work I exhausted myself and my family doing the first 6 months, most of it was wasted because it was poorly planned, poorly thought out and not well done, and I had to redo it all. Now, I never got into the details, but I imagine in that setting, a farmer could say, oh, I've got my fence washed away, I'll put the fence up, and then realise 6 months later that there's no pasture growing because it's had gravel washed all over it, and he would have done much better to have, instead of fencing that, leave it for a few years to grass and divide another paddock or something like that, you know. Strategic thinking. I was speaking last week about how we cannot think strategically and laterally thinking and creative problem solving. And we cannot think that way when we're in this state of adrenaline and high stress. We've got to get out of that state to use our mind. So really this is saying that there's a massive change in the social fabric, but if we're focused on our problems, we don't notice it. And there's big research been done in the United States looking at big comparisons across large numbers of different disaster-affected communities. Somebody's done a research on all the communities in Japan affected by the tsunami, and you can get all the statistics, and he says the one thing that predicts how well the community, how quickly the community responds, how many of the people come back, and how well they're doing is social networking. The degree to which people put time and money and investment in community organisation, in self-help groups, in advocacy, in community representation, and so on and so forth. It's not correlated, according to the statistics, with the amount of money that is spent on infrastructure and so on. Now, it's not to say that they are not very, very important. But after all, infrastructure is to support social life, isn't it? And I think it's really important that we actually have the long-term goal in play, so that we're working towards a long-term goal, not trying to replace the past. You know, recovery actually means, if you look in the dictionary, to regain a lost state of health, wealth, or happiness, right? I recover my mood. I recover from the flu. We won't talk about the coronavirus. I recover from a financial loss. But most people, no, many people will say a disaster is a watershed experience. Things won't be quite the same. They've got to do it differently. Doesn't mean they can't have a good life, but it's going to be different. And very often the values change. People have a damaged sense of safety. So we've got to rebuild safety. We have to rebuild it for our kids. The kids have a big, horrible experience, and we have to put it into context so that we can restore the sense of safety. And just like we learn to live with snakes and fast cars on the road and redback spiders and sharks, we can learn to live with natural disasters, but we've got to actually take the risk on and know that we know what to do and have good procedures. So this sense of how do we look to the future becomes the important point, I think. And we've got to get our brains in the right space to do that. What we notice in the community is that once the fusion is really locked in, people they feel this tremendous cooperation and camaraderie and mutual aid and help, but they're all homogenised and too close. And so in that adrenaline state, our brains make us judgmental, black and white judgments. And now that starts to spill out. The black and white judgment is a bull going for me or somebody else? Am I in danger, or am I going to get out or not? That's what serves us. But then that can become, what's your problem? You didn't lose your house. Why are you complaining? If you'd gone up to Kinglake after Black Saturday and you went up from the Melba Highway, when you got halfway up, amongst this sort of moonscape of charred trees, you know very well what it looks like, there was a house tucked away, and there was a large piece of galvanised iron wired to a couple of star droppers, and in runny painted writing was, "This house survived because we stayed and fought." Something like that. It's a judgment, isn't it? Of course, we know that a lot of people in a few streets down there all died while they were trying to defend their houses. You know, it's a judgment, isn't it? And of course that's going to really upset a lot of people. These kind of judgments start to emerge in the fusion when people start to become aware of differences. We thought we all went through the same experience. Nobody's had the same disaster experience. There's very little relationship, the researchers find, between the degree of distress that a person is feeling and the degree of physical impact. This guy who did all the research in Japan, Daniel Aldrich is his name, came out to Melbourne and gave a talk in the public library. Now this man had moved into New Orleans to take up a new professorship in political science a few weeks before Hurricane Katrina. He didn't know anything about disasters, he said. And so when the warnings came, he got in the car with his wife and kids and they drove over the state border and spent a nice weekend with some friends. Their house was completely flooded to the ceiling and they lost absolutely everything, including all his computers and all his research and everything, which put him on a much more interesting course of research, didn't it? Understanding disaster recovery. When he did this presentation, he put up a map of New Orleans at the beginning, and it was colour-coded, shaded, according to the depth of water. And some parts were not flooded and others were, 6 feet under or whatever, and they're all different colours. And this was the results of a big interview they'd done, where they'd interviewed 1,000 people in New Orleans from all over the city, and each of these people was a dot. And the dots were colour-coded according to how severely these people felt the disaster had affected their lives. And he asked the audience, what's the relationship between the depth of water and the degree of effect? And you could just see this puzzled look. There's no relationship. There were some people who weren't flooded at all who showed profound effect, and other people who were completely flooded who actually said it didn't affect us that greatly. It's about people's circumstances. It's not just insurance, but it's a whole lot of other things. So this is a really hard thing to get around. You can't grasp this when you're in adrenaline mode because you're all about the simple impact. And, in my work with trauma, I've had to, again, develop a language because I notice that you don't have to be present at a bad event to be traumatised. We know this when we hear about something terrible happening and you feel really upset about it. If it's your loved ones, you're very badly affected. So I say that those people who are present, who see it, who feel under threat, experience it through their senses. And I call that a sensory trauma. And the problem is they've got the impression on their senses, the smells, the images, the sounds, that keep coming back and back and back. That's a sensory trauma. But the people who aren't there hear about it. How do they hear about it? People talk to them, or they read about it, or they see it on television. I hope they don't do that. But we know people. This same woman I spoke to, no, it was another person I spoke to, actually saw her house burning on Facebook because a neighbour went out there with a camera and filmed it. So she watched it on Facebook. She didn't get back for about 3 weeks to her community. And during that time, it was real but not real. It's a very confusing state. Now, when you don't even know what it was exactly like, what do? If you're emotionally involved, you imagine, don't you? And what you imagine is often not accurate. It's often more awful than the reality, and so on. So we haven't got time to go into it all, but the informational trauma has a quite different structure than the sensory trauma. The sensory trauma is an isolating experience where I experience what I experience as imprinted. It was where I was, what I saw, what I smelled. It's just me. It's a very isolating personal thing. The sensory trauma, I need more information. I need to talk to people. I'm very open. I'm hurt by what they say. I imagine. I brew up all these fantasies and they keep changing all the time because I'm trying to imagine it. It's an unstable, it's a very painful, and I think in some ways a bit harder to come to grips with because everything is so uncertain unless they actually get the facts and get a clear account of it all. And so you get this, the people who are not here are still liable to be profoundly affected, even if they come back and find their house is still there. I invented another term after Ash Wednesday. I remember a woman telling me they were sheltering in the Oval in Macedon. And the poor old traumatised fire truck comes staggering in. The fireys fall off the truck and said, "Oh, it's terrible out there. Your house is gone. Yours is okay. Yours is gone. Yours is gone. Yours is not there." hopefully we've got better procedures now. And so this person spends the rest of the night letting go of their house. She said in the morning they got in their car and they drove, and when they came around the corner, there it was standing. What do you think she felt? Not relief, but disappointment, because she's actually been attuning herself to not have a house, and it's suddenly there. She's debonded from the house and she has to rebond, and that's a very confusing state of mind. You know, that's just one example of the complex things that happen. Now, what I'm really getting to is what we know will help all of these things work out, will bring the arousal down, is conversation, talking about it. Not emotively, you know, but telling our story, converting these raw experiences into a narrative that connects up, and we can lock everyone's story into a community narrative, a community history. Because that's what we actually all do in our normal fabric of, isn't it? Our normal fabric of community, except for the dairy farmers. Sorry, present company accepted, but the dairy farmers of my lady from the beginning of the, you know, who didn't talk about anything. But normally we talk, don't we? We chatter, we gossip, we exchange. Maybe if we don't do it at home, we've got other friends we talk. And it's this is a very healthy thing, this conversation. And so that is a byproduct of social encounters and social organisation. And I think in the process of talking, we become self-aware. And when we become self-aware, we can actually stop and think, hang on a second, we haven't talked to each other for quite a long time. Maybe we should go out to dinner and get someone to look after the kids. Or maybe we should sit with the kids and have fun. I want to say a few words about kids in a minute, but really look after that social fabric and realise that the biggest asset you have is your community. This has now been proven by all the statistical studies. Communities that work together, that solve their problems, that overcome the splits and disagreements and misunderstandings, do better economically in a few years' time because they're working together. There's a big problem with retention of people in communities. In Victoria we notice, well, I've noticed there's about a 40% turnover in the next few years in small country communities. In Marysville, where there was a particularly horrific time with a lot of death, they've lost about 60% of their community. That's a very big disruption. It's a tremendous loss of social capital, of relationships and history and so on. And this research shows that those communities that put their energy into holding everything together don't lose nearly so many people. People want to stay. In some communities I notice there's a gulf between people who move in afterwards. They never quite feel they belong. Versus Strathewen, which is a very small community, which probably had about the greatest amount of death and loss per capita of any of the communities. It's a small community but very isolated. And they made a very big effort to hold their community together, so that a few years later, when a young couple, young family moved in and bought a house right in the middle, because, you know, land was cheap and the house had been burnt down, and they bought this house and they were struggling, the whole community reached out to them and drew them in. And when they had their 10-year anniversary of Black Saturday, they had all the old people, you know, the old community members talk about the history. And then they asked this person to stand up at the end and talk about what it was like to come into this community. He said, you know, it's been so welcoming. And they all said, he's our future. The newcomers are our future. They belong to us. We need them. You know, and they've moved beyond this sense of, well, what do you know? You weren't here, which is the sort of unreflective state. So this is really my message is we have to do that in our families, with our children, with our relationships, with our friendship networks. We have to take care of them and then rebuild as we can. Because if we get too exhausted, we don't bounce back. We lose a certain amount of health that we don't get back, and we make poor decisions. Now, I wanted to say a little bit about kids, but I wonder whether anyone's got any questions or thoughts about what I've said so far.
Yes, I'd like to ask a question. Do you think, in your expertise, that it would make a difference for people to overcome their memories from the point of view of that instant impact? We left 3/4 of an hour before the fire and had to travel an hour and a half to bed that night. 3/4 of the way back, I called our neighbour to ask how they were going. The previous night, we got a little sleep, watched what was going on, and it seemed like our neighbour over the hill and down below had lost theirs. And I was very sad for him to have lost his house. 3/4 of the way back, I called my neighbour to ask how they were going, and he said, fine. And next door's fine, but you've lost your house. And Ron's driving, and I'm stunned. I guess 60 seconds passed by, that seemed like an hour. And he asks, are you there? Are you good? Which I say, yes. What did you just say? And he said, oh, you've lost your house. Now, we have no family. We drive the rest of the way home on our own, wondering what the heck are we going to face. We had no idea. We drove up to find that there is nothing. I'm just wondering, in your opinion, would it help people in that situation, whether it be one house that's been burnt down, or God forbid this should happen again, here or somewhere else? There should be a mechanism in play, now that, excuse the pun, that the heat's gone, the heat of the moment's over, that there could be perhaps some thought into establishing a group of people who are trained, whether or not in counsellors or in the trauma area, that when a person's house has been severely damaged or, in our case, completely destroyed by a firestorm, that the police, fire brigade, contacting the neighbour, somebody would know how to contact the people who's lost their house.
Yes, I think so.
That then they are contacted in a supportive, counselling type way to meet, to have the news broken in a more desirable way, and to be accompanied as a support system when we have to go and face what we had to. And I think reflecting back to that time where we were just totally
You're describing shock. You can't process it, so you say, what did you say? You've heard the words, but you can't process it. So, dead silence. Say it again. And then, what do? What you're describing is not just the house, but the social structure. Your house is the anchor for your social world, isn't it? It's where you have your sense of home. You know, people who've lost their house, you probably feel this. I just want to go home. You know, okay, it's a nice house to be living in, but I want to go home. There's no home. You've got to recreate a home, and you can't do that straight away. You have to build, you have to live in it. And so you're quite right. You were told about it in a way that was not attentive to your state. Your neighbour would have been in adrenaline mode, wouldn't he? And he just rattled it out. He's okay, but you've lost yours. Boom. Terrible. Yes, it would be great if we could, but you'd have to have an overarching containment of the situation. I had a little bit of dealings with and made a trip to Fort McMurray in Canada. This place that it's a community of about 80,000 that were surrounded by fire way up in the north of, and they all had to evacuate. And the distance from Fort McMurray to Calgary is about the same as from Melbourne to Sydney, and there's nothing in between. Now, what they did was, because they couldn't let people back in for a long time, weeks, they actually used NASA satellites and got some special help from NASA to get finer, resolution, And then the council organised sessions where people could come in together with, really what we're talking about is people like Red Cross psychological first aiders, support people, could actually be with people and they could actually look down the map and try and identify whether their house was there or not in a supportive environment. And I think that would be preferable if you could do it. But you're going to get Facebook and all these things, but it would be much better.
Excuse me, would some local authority, like council to be available, police, knocking on the neighbour's door to find out how they could contact us?
Yes.
And then arrange for a supportive way of meeting us and
yes.
And
I certainly think that will help people to absorb it and to make a better adaptation to it and reduce the ongoing stress from it. And yeah, I think it's a really important thing to maybe put up. Presumably there will be some kind of review or investigation. I think it'd be a really important contribution to think about how that aspect can be taken in. Because the suddenness is part of the quality of a trauma. If you had somebody, take you in and sit you down and say, so where do you live again? Okay, let me look at the maps. Look, I'm really sorry. There's been a lot of losses, but let's have a look at you. Oh, look, I'm sorry. All those sort of preliminaries help you sort of get ready. And then when you hear the news, you're ready for it instead of this sudden. The way you tell it is really dramatic. Yeah, very important. Any other? Yeah.
You said you would talk next about children.
Yeah. So there's a huge experience in this kind of a bushfire that challenges and disrupts a lot of very basic feelings of safety, security, predictability. These are the things that make us skin. I didn't talk about how we form the skin. The skin is about the routines that give us the feeling that we don't have to pay any attention to certain things. My house will always be there. My stuff will be there. My family will be there. They might annoy me, but they'll be there. I don't have to think about whether they're there. I just think about what they're doing, whether they've made their bed. The kids, I mean. And that's part of the skin. The skin is what we don't have to pay attention to. We've got a job, we go there, We've got a bathroom, that the socks are in the sock drawer and the pots are in this cupboard, not that cupboard. And all of that process gives us this security and stability. Now, when this is upturned and lost, we have uncertainty. And uncertainty creates anxiety. This nebulous feeling of unease and unsafety, and uncomfortable, irritable. So that when kids have this experience, they don't know what they can depend on for a while. So one of the most important things, I think, is to rebuild a routine of life that is attuned to where they are and what they need. And how do we do that? Well, I remember being in Christchurch and talking, with communities there about there were a tremendous lot of problems with kids there. And I tried to think, how do I actually distill this into a very simple statement? And what I came up with is that I think things will be all right if, no matter what's going on, you try to just give your children your full attention every day for a little while, whatever you can manage. Or if you can't do it every day, every second day, make sure you just give them your full attention. Be present with them. It's not about doing all sorts of things, it's about being with them and seeing what follows. One of the things we notice is that when parents feel their children may have had a bad experience, a frightening experience, a trauma, they suddenly become very uneasy. What should I be doing? What should we do? My child is frightened or having nightmares or whatever. Teachers have a child come and talk to them and the child bursts into tears, there's a bit of a tendency for teachers to say, oh, well, we better get counselling. The child's got upset. The message I would want to give is, no, the child has chosen you to share their unhappiness and their fear. That's a privilege, and it's an expression of trust. I'm choosing you because I reckon you'll listen to me. So you're the one that needs to deal with it. Now, maybe afterwards you go to the counsellor or the support officer and say, I said this, did I do the right thing? Actually, you don't have to do anything except listen, share it, be there with them. That's the important thing. Whereas, of course, as parents, we want to fix it up. But if they've lost pets and property and their friends have lost stuff, or, they don't have to lose it themselves to be very upset. They know how many kids in their class have lost stuff. And if the teacher hasn't talked about it, they'll talk about it behind the changing shed. You remember talking about stuff behind the changing sheds? And the gossip and the rumours that go around? And the lurid stories that are told? It's much better to actually have it out in the open, tactfully, gently, just open it up. What I say to schools is, it's really good to open the conversation on this experience, because children grow and change the way they see things, and their ability to think and understand will change from year to year. And they will start to reinterpret things. And they want to ask questions in 2 or 3 years' time when there's a bushfire somewhere else. And if the subject is being opened up and they feel safe to talk about it, that's when they'll do the processing, not when everyone's trying to get things together in the next year or two. So anything you can do to just make it something that is okay to talk about or not talk about, whatever they feel, bring it up. Make sure that if you see anything on television, explain it in detail, because children will form ideas that are not accurate. A colleague of mine during the period of September 11 found that young children, probably preschool children, would look at their mum watching the television and crying about this tragedy in New York, and because mum's crying, they presume it's happening in Melbourne and we're in danger, And so if mum doesn't explain why she's crying, they're going to personalise it. And the next thing would be, say, you're crying because of me. If mum is really upset and goes and cries in the bedroom, close the door and the kids are watching television, don't think they don't know. And she should come out afterwards and say, I'm feeling better now, it's a bit sad, but we'll be right. Just actually say, this is the baseline here, me with you, talking to you, listen to you, and whatever else is, I'll deal with it. You don't need to worry about it. I want to say just a couple of things. One is one of the best indicators of how kids go is how the parents are. Because we do a lot of focus on the kids, and yes, we should provide opportunities for them to talk. But I think the more you can look after yourself, then the more you model for the kids their ability, your ability to cope with it, and therefore that gives them confidence. So that means really the best thing you can give them is your own peace of mind and productivity and confidence and so on. And part of that would be to try, when you say the people are without a skin, you get irritable, don't you? You argue, you have short tempers, you get angry, with your partner or whatever. So I think one thing that's really important to do is try to make a commitment to hold your manners. Sound like an old man, don't I? Just hold your manners. Just try, because manners is a sort of a way of preserving values, isn't it? Just treat each other with respect and, politely, and don't swear and all this sort of thing. And that will actually hold a tone. What the researchers find is a big predictor is negative emotional tone in the families. And so that really seeing how you can hold that together for the kids. Now, think about it. The kids have got this huge experience. They may have felt really frightened for the first time in their lives. How do they deal with that? It takes a lot of emotional energy and attention to deal with that. But now let's think about what's happening with kids anyway. They're changing all the time, aren't they? And they're having to do new things all the time. Us adults just like to do the same thing every day, don't we, every week? We don't like much change, and we can organise our lives so that we keep our job for a while and so on. But kids are always changing. They're always having to learn new things. Think about can you remember when you learned to ride a bike? How for a while you got really excited, I'd really like to learn to bike, and then you've been scared, and then finally you plucked up your courage and you had a go and you fell off and skinned your knees and you didn't want to do it for a while, and then you had another go and your friend said, no, we're doing it, and so on. So it's this whole sort of energetic engagement with and conquering a part of the world. And then remember the glee of your first bike ride? This moment of freedom that puts you in another place. So that process of development means I've got to have a lot of energy to tackle this, and the only reward that keeps me going is the achievement of getting that new freedom or that competence or the skill or whatever. Think about doing it in the peer group, getting into the peer group and learning to do something and being accepted. And it's really hard work, isn't it? Now, if you've got a huge thing in your mind, you're going to have to use a lot of energy to hold that in place. And you don't have spare energy to go into big, adventurous, challenging, difficult tasks. So what we see is kids don't want to do it. They actually want to go back to a time in their life where the skills were already well developed and they actually have got spare energy. It's all routine, like you want to go into your house and just have everything in the right place so you can actually come to grips with losing your house, but you can't do it. So you can't do all the things you normally have to do. And in the same way, the kids can't do. Now, what that looks like is that for kids, they're going to go back to an earlier stage of their development where everything is well established and routine. And we've got a name for that, it's called regression. Now, if you look at the handouts and so on, they'll talk about young kids might start wetting their beds or sucking their thumbs or whatever. That's really not the important point. Most children will, teenagers, and not to mention us as adults, actually want to go back to being looked after a bit more. And that frees up emotional energy to cope with what we've got in our minds. So that this tendency to go back to behaviour in a younger age is a very important way of releasing capacity to actually process it and come to grips with it. Because if you can't, you have to keep doing what you have to do, then you're not going to be able to process it. And what we've got to remember is that post-traumatic stress disorder is a problem of failed recovery. Everyone has the symptoms straight away. If you've been through a really bad experience, everyone can't stop thinking about it, feels upset, is jumping at shadows and so on. But most people settle. It's the people who don't settle. What settles us? We give attention and energy to restoring our sense of confidence. And we've got to have that source of energy. And to do that, we may have to let go of some other things. Not go to work for a little while if we're an adult. Or if we're a kid, not make our bed. Not do our homework for a while. Just go back. So I think it's really important to look at the pattern of kids' behaviour and see if they're going back. Not to say, I'm sure you wouldn't say it, but, some people say, well, just because we lost our house doesn't mean you don't make your bed, now get in there and make it. Or just because you've lost your house doesn't mean you don't do your homework because you've got year 12 coming up, and if you don't get there, your whole life will be ruined. Now get on, And the poor old kids thinking, I know, kids, I've worked with kids who actually think, I've got year 12, my whole life depends, I've got to keep, and then they bomb out in their first year at uni because they just can't cope. They put their whole bushfire experience and suddenly the post-traumatic stress breaks out halfway through uni and they can't do the uni. They have to go and take another It would be much better if they did it earlier. This is easier. So therefore, that's a very important principle. So that means, I think, be responsive. And if you give attention to kids, observe them, talk about them, by all means talk about them with professionals, get advice, help you clarify your uncertainty, talk about them with teachers and anyone else that knows them. And this will help you keep track of what's going on, because we know that kids by and large have a capacity to recover very well, provided that we let them do it their own way. And I would say, just to finish, the most important thing for kids getting through trauma is to resume their development. Resume their development, which, you know, for young kids means play. Play is how young kids learn. For primary school kids, social life, peer groups, being with their friends. For teenagers, also being with their friends and so on. And to really hold the structure of those activities and then build your house as you can. Let that happen, and then you come out the other end and things are going well. Now, I probably better stop talking because otherwise everyone's going to go to sleep, but has anyone got any particular questions?
Could you talk a little,
Yep.
Could you talk a little bit, you talked about community and the importance of community connection and building that social fabric. Could you talk a bit about positive things for a community to do collectively?
So at the organisational level, I think the idea of having building some kind of representative group that is built around the disaster issues, that hopefully represents everybody, kind of link over the inevitable differences in history and so on that is in any community. Try and bring that together. It's a structure. In Victoria we'd call it a community recovery committee. It's part of the national values or standards about recovery is community representation, because if you think about it, normally government only has fairly restricted involvement with people's lives. But after a disaster, there are a huge range of intimate parts of people's lives that government's going to suddenly get involved with at the same time. And the government, my observation is governments can't get it right, because that's not what they usually do, unless they have an enhanced feedback loop from the community that will tell them what we need, when we need it, how we need it. And therefore, I think the building of a representative group, and that may take time. I don't think it matters how long it takes. It's the building of it that is the cohesive thing. And I think of it as like a community sense organ. So nobody knows the whole community. We only know the bits we know, don't we? And we don't know what we don't know by definition. So unless we get people together from very different networks, we're not going to actually form an overview of the community. So that'd be the formal organisation. And then I think anything that brings people together and add to it opportunities for social interaction and informal conversation, any meetings about services or advice about farms or whatever, I think put on some sausages and whatever. And then, it's good to have people, mental health or education or whatever, who can actually give little short presentations just about, I don't know, anything to do with what else might be going on, so that people, they go to learn about pasture, but they'll get a little thing on, problem solving and anger management or whatever, and then they go up and talk to people afterwards. So that, you add it and you just keep that all going, keep it going. I think a wonderful thing is to have, the Lions Club or someone put on a barbecue every Friday night, here or there or anywhere, for a couple of years. And you'll see how people will start to use it. Don't worry about how many people come, just keep doing it. Or maybe in your little locality, just bring people together, and you'll see it build, because everyone needs to talk, because nobody has been through this before, or, you know. So that'll be the sort of thing to build, yeah.
You said the last time too that our friends and family who aren't impacted by this,
Yes.
they may get sick of us talking about it.
Yes.
But that's what is going to help us recover.
Yep.
And I'm just wondering if, in what you've just said too, that I've mentioned it to a few other people, but I don't know how to go about it. Would just a support group, just so that you can get together and have a bit
Absolutely.
of a progress
Yeah.
of where you're at and what's happened or whatever.
So some people are well connected and have lots of friends who will be very patient and listen to them. And just to repeat the point I made last time, if you listen to people talking, and I spend my whole working life listening to people talking, they sometimes need to, this lady that I started the story with goes over the same ground, you know. Now, if you are there to be entertained, it'd be boring. But actually, what I listen to is, what is she saying that she didn't say last time? And what is she not saying that she did say last time? That's where the movement is. It might be 10% on either end. The bulk of it is the same. But that's where the movement is. And that'll tell you what she's moving on to. And you'll find that a person will have a progress through it if you let them talk. So it's a really important thing for the friends and relatives to think, I'm doing them a favour by just listening and, you know, then interacting. But so one of the problems is people will find quickly that many of their friends and relatives are not up for it. And they say things like, look, you've got to be positive, look on the bright side, get over it, it could have been worse. You know, you only lost your fences, what's the problem? Or whatever it might be. You only lost your house, you could have died. You only lost one leg, you could have lost two, you know? I've worked in a situation where, you know, a person was uninjured, but other people were seriously injured. And her friend said, aren't you lucky you weren't hurt? And she said, no, I was very unlucky. I was there and had the most terrible experience of my life. I was very, very unlucky, and I've had a horrible experience, and I want you to listen to it. Because the friend is listening to somebody else's experience, aren't they? Now, if that's happening, then I think what you suggest is a really valuable thing, to establish support groups that work well, maybe if they're facilitated by somebody who can make sure it's, you know, it's properly set up and kept safe and so on. But also, I think community groups will do it. So that would be another sort of organisation where you can promote groups to come together and, you know, select out who they want to be with. And it's the talking in a constructive environment. How are we going? Any other questions? I'm happy to take questions afterwards if you want to come and talk to me, but probably I'll let you all go home. Well, look, thanks very much. Any other?